The morning Douglas Whitfield decided his mother's fate, he sat in his dead father's chair. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. Not the brochures Carolyn had fanned across the coffee table like a hand of cards. Not the nervous way Patrick kept shifting his weight on the ottoman, crossing and uncrossing his ankles. Not even the particular tone Douglas had already arranged in his voice before he opened his mouth, that careful, patient tone people use with small children, and the very old, as though both categories have somehow misplaced their right to be spoken to directly. No, Eleanor May Whitfield, 93 years old, sitting in her red velvet armchair by the window, noticed first that her oldest son had settled himself into Arthur's leather recliner without asking, without pausing, without a single moment of hesitation. He had simply walked across the living room of the house on Birchwood Lane and lowered himself into the chair where Arthur James Whitfield had read the newspaper every morning for 41 years. And Douglas had done it the way a man does when he believes somewhere beneath conscious thought that the things of the dead now belong to him. Eleanor said nothing. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. She had been waiting for this conversation for 6 months, perhaps longer. Mom, Douglas began, and so it started. Eleanor had been 21 years old when she met Arthur at a church social in the summer of 1952, and the first thing she had noticed about him before his kind eyes or his careful hands or the quiet steadiness that would anchor her life for the next 6.5 decades was that he had made her laugh without trying. He had knocked over a glass of lemonade, reaching past her for a napkin, then spent 4 minutes constructing an elaborate apology that somehow managed to blame the table, the church's poor lighting, and the particular way the moon was positioned that evening. And Eleanor had laughed so hard she nearly knocked over her own glass, and Arthur had caught it without breaking eye contact, and that was that. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony that Eleanor's mother called rushed, and Arthur's commanding officer, who attended as a personal favor, called inevitable. Arthur had come back from Korea the year before with a piece of shrapnel still lodged near his left shoulder blade, and a habit which he kept the rest of his life of never raising his voice when he was angry. He had learned that in the infantry, he told her once years later when she finally asked. The men who shouted the loudest in a firefight were the ones who had already decided they were going to die. The ones who stayed quiet were the ones still making decisions. He made decisions quietly for 65 years. He decided quietly in the first year of their marriage that he had been guessing what Eleanor needed instead of asking her, and so he began asking. Every evening before sleep, the same question offered the same way a man offers something he has thought about carefully. What did you need today that I didn't think to ask about? It became the architecture of their marriage. Not romance in the way magazines described it. Something more durable than that. A daily practice of paying attention. Eleanor remembered the first time he asked it. She had laughed a little confused and said she didn't know what he meant. Arthur had said simply that he'd noticed she sometimes looked out the window in the evening with an expression he couldn't read, and he thought maybe there were things she needed that she hadn't said, and he wanted to know what they were. She had looked at him across the bed in the small apartment on Millbrook Avenue, and she had thought, this man is going to matter more to me than I know how to say. She had been right. They bought the house on Birchwood Lane in 1959, the year Douglas was born, a modest 2-story in Asheville, North Carolina, with a yard deep enough for a garden and a kitchen, large enough for the life they were planning. Caroline followed in 1961, Patrick in 1964. Arthur built the children's bookshelves by hand, the same way he built everything slowly and with complete attention, as though the thing he was making deserved to be made well. Eleanor took in sewing work, alterations, custom orders, wedding dresses in the spring. She ran the house and contributed to the finances and raised 3 children who did not always make it easy, and she did all of it with the same practical competence she brought to everything, which was the competence of a woman who understood without bitterness that the world did not stop requiring things of you simply because you were tired. Arthur's carpentry business grew into a contracting firm. They were not wealthy, they were stable, which Eleanor had always valued more. They were partners, which she valued most of all. There was a period from 1971 to 1974 when the business nearly failed. She had not spoken of it to the children in 30 years, and she did not intend to speak of it tonight. But she remembered the weight of those 3 years, the extra alterations she took in without telling Arthur how tired her hands were by evening, the notebook she kept in the back of the kitchen drawer, where she tracked every dollar of her separate income, the careful management of her own exhaustion, so that Arthur would not feel more burdened than he already did. He had found the notebook in 1975. He had not said a word about it for 3 days. Then one evening he sat down across from her at the kitchen table and asked the question he always asked. And when she gave him the same answer, she always gave the answer that meant everything is fine. He had reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said, "Tell me what those years actually cost you." She had told him. It had taken a long time. He had listened to all of it. He did not apologize with words. What he did was something more demanding than that he changed. The question he asked every evening became sharper, after that more specific, less willing to accept fine as an answer. He paid attention differently, the way a man pays attention when he understands that the person across from him has been carrying things he did not see. Eleanor thought about this now, watching Douglas arrange his expression into something he believed looked like loving concern, and she thought Arthur saw me. All those years he kept seeing me. And these children of mine who love me, genuinely love me, have somehow forgotten to look. "We've been talking," Douglas said, "and we think it's time for an honest conversation about your living situation." "My living situation is fine," Eleanor said. Her voice was calm, her hands were folded. "Mom." Carolyn leaned forward. She had laid out the Meadowbrook senior living brochures in a neat row, glossy and full of photographs of silver-haired people laughing over meals they had not cooked themselves. "You're 93. You're alone in this house. We worry." "You've been worrying for 2 years, Eleanor said. "I've been fine for 2 years. "For now," Douglas said. That phrase, "for now," had become the family's quiet weapon against her. Everything she did well existed only for now. Every morning she managed, every meal she cooked, every medication she took correctly was just another temporary reprieve before the inevitable collapse they had already scheduled in their minds. Patrick had not spoken yet. He was looking at the floor between his feet. Eleanor noticed that too. "We've looked into several places," Carolyn continued, and her voice had taken on the bright, encouraging tone of someone presenting options they have already decided upon. She touched the nearest brochure. "Meadowbrook is really lovely. They have activities, medical staff on site, meals 3 times a day, your own apartment. It's not a nursing home, Mom, it's a community." "I have a community," Eleanor said. "I've had one for 64 years. It's called this neighborhood." "There's something else." Douglas looked at Caroline, a look Eleanor had seen them exchange her entire adult life. The look that means "I'll do it," and usually means the difficult thing has already been decided. "We've already contacted Meadowbrook. We put your name on the list. There's an opening on the 14th, 3 weeks from now." The room went quiet in a specific way that rooms go quiet when something irreversible has just been said. Eleanor did not move. She looked at her oldest son sitting in his dead father's chair, and she heard underneath the words he had just spoken what he had not said: "We have already done this. We have already decided. This conversation is not a discussion, it is a notification." "You put my name on a list," she said without asking me. "We're asking you now," Douglas said. "No," Eleanor said very quietly. "You're telling me now. Those are different things." Caroline's expression flickered. For just a moment, something that might have been shame moved across her face before the concerned daughter arrangement returned. "Mom, we did it because we didn't want to lose the spot. These places fill up quickly. We were trying to be proactive." "You were trying to manage a problem," Eleanor said. "I am the problem." "That's not fair," Patrick said finally from the ottoman. His voice was soft and he was still looking at the floor. "We're scared, Mom. We don't want something to happen to you when no one's around." And Eleanor looked at her youngest son, the one who had always been the most gentle of the three, and she felt for him the most complicated kind of love, the love that can see clearly what a person is and forgive them for it at the same time. Patrick was scared, that was true. What was also true was that Patrick's fear was not her responsibility to solve, and the solution they had chosen for their fear was to remove her from her own life. After her children left, satisfied in the way people are satisfied, when they believe they have handled a difficult situation responsibly. Eleanor sat in the red velvet armchair as the light changed in the room and the evening sounds of Birchwood Lane came through the window she had left open. A dog 2 houses down, a car starting, the particular creak of the oak tree in the side yard that she had been listening to for 64 years. She sat with all of it for a long time. Then she got up, walked upstairs, and stood in front of the small nightstand on Arthur's side of the bed. The drawer had been locked since the morning 3 years ago, when she had found him in the garden on his knees among the roses he had been tending, his pruning shears still in his right hand. She had locked it that evening without opening it, not ready, and had not opened it since. She had a key on her own keychain, had always had. It had simply been choosing for 3 years not to use it. She unlocked the drawer. Inside was a plain white envelope. Her name on the front in Arthur's handwriting, precise, unhurried, the handwriting of a man who did not rush things. Beneath her name in smaller letters, when you need to remember who you are. She did not open it that night. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and held it in both hands and thought about the fact that Arthur had known. He had left this here for exactly this moment, which meant he had seen this coming years before it arrived. He had watched their children, understood them, loved them, and quietly, without telling her, done something about the thing he could see was going to happen. He had always been making decisions. She simply had not known about all of them. She put the envelope on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark with her eyes open. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks, and she was not going to spend them waiting. Eleanor opened the envelope on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee. The house quiet around her in the way it was always quiet now, a quiet that had its own texture and weight, different from the quiet of a house where someone was merely in another room. Arthur's letter was 4 pages written by hand, in the same careful script as her name on the envelope. She read it slowly the way she had always read things that mattered, and she understood by the second page that her husband had not simply left her a letter. He had left her a map. The cabin. She had not thought about the cabin in years. That was the honest truth of it, and she sat with it for a moment without flinching, because Eleanor had long ago decided that honesty with herself was the only kind of honesty that was always available. She had not thought about the cabin because thinking about it had meant thinking about Arthur Young, Arthur Strong, Arthur with sawdust on his shirt and satisfaction on his face. And for 3 years, those thoughts had been too heavy to carry voluntarily. But Arthur had thought about it. He had been thinking about it for a long time. The cabin sat on 5 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains northwest of Boone, North Carolina, a structure Arthur had spent a year rebuilding from near ruin in the early 1980s. Weekend after weekend, the children left with Eleanor's mother in Asheville, while Arthur drove up alone or with Eleanor beside him, both of them treating the whole project like an adventure they were having before the word adventure got replaced by responsibility. They had bought the property under her maiden name, Eleanor May Dawson. Arthur's idea, he explained in the letter, because a contractor's records were public, and he wanted something that could not be found by anyone looking through their finances, something that belonged to the two of them alone. They had not told the children. They had not told anyone. The letter explained the trust. It explained Gerald Sutton Arthur's attorney and the account, and the way the property taxes had been paid for 40 years through an arrangement Arthur had structured specifically so that it would continue after his death. He had thought of everything with the same methodical care he brought to building anything measuring twice, accounting for the ways things could go wrong. At the bottom of the 3rd page in handwriting that pressed slightly harder than the rest, as though he had leaned into the words, "You've spent 90 years taking care of everyone else. I built that place for both of us, but I'm leaving it for you. Not as a retreat, as a home if you need one. You have every right to it. You have every right to choose." Eleanor read the last page twice. Then she folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and sat for a while looking out the kitchen window at the garden she had planted. Herself, the roses along the back fence, the kitchen herbs near the door. 3 weeks. She began that afternoon. She did not write a plan because written plans could be found. She kept the plan in her head, which had always been where she kept the most important things. She looked up the bus routes on the old desktop computer in the corner of the living room, the one Arthur had taught her to use with the patience of a man who understood that new tools were worth learning, found the schedule from Asheville to Boone, with a connection in between, noted the departure times, closed the browser. She started taking out money. Not large amounts. $160 here, $180 there from the ATM on the corner of Haverford Street, on her morning walks, tucking the cash into the inner pocket of her winter coat in the hall closet. She refilled her prescriptions 4 days early each time, accumulating a supply in the bottom of her sewing basket beneath the spools of thread that no one had touched since she'd slowed down the alterations work 2 years ago. She packed slowly, a little each day, choosing carefully what was essential, folding items into the large wheeled suitcase she kept on the shelf in the bedroom closet. Practical clothes, her medications, the important documents she had always kept in the metal box under the bed: birth certificate, marriage license, her copy of the property deed and Arthur's letter, the worn leather journal she had kept for 20 years, the envelope. On the 10th day, Caroline came by without calling first. Eleanor heard the car in the driveway and had only a few seconds to think. She was sitting at the desk, the computer screen showing the bus schedule she had been reviewing. She did not close the browser. She turned in her chair and waited for the sound of the door. Caroline came in the way she always came in now, with a quality of alertness that was trying to disguise itself as a casual visit, her eyes making their quick inventory of the room before she had finished saying hello. They landed on the computer screen. "What are you looking at?" Caroline asked. "Bus routes," Eleanor said. She kept her voice easy, factual. Caroline came closer. She looked at the screen. Asheville to Boone with the connection times laid out. She was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor watched her daughter's mind work through what she was seeing, watched the moment when it arrived at its conclusion. "Mom," Caroline said, and her voice changed, softened. Something real came into it, something that was not the concerned daughter performance, but was actually Caroline, the woman underneath all the worry. "Are you trying to figure out how to get to Meadowbrook on your own, so you don't have to ask us?" Eleanor looked at her daughter. She thought about saying no. That is not what this is. She thought about watching Caroline's face change as she explained what was actually on this screen, what she was actually planning, what was going to happen in 5 days. Instead, she said, "I don't want to be a burden about transportation." Caroline crossed the room and put her arms around her mother from behind the ways she had not done since she was a teenager, impulsive and warm. "Oh, Mom," she said, "you're not a burden. You're never a burden." Eleanor sat very still inside her daughter's embrace. She looked at the bus schedule on the screen. She thought about the 5 days remaining, the suitcase with its careful contents, the envelope on the nightstand with Arthur's letter inside. "I know," she said. After Caroline left, Eleanor sat alone with the specific quality of silence that follows a conversation where everything important went unsaid. She was not angry. She was not sad. She was something more precise than either of those somethings she had no particular name for, but recognized the feeling of being completely understood incorrectly by someone who loves you. It was, she had learned over 93 years, one of the loneliest feelings in the world. That night, she opened her journal to a clean page and wrote one sentence. Not a plan, not a list. She wrote, "Arthur, are you sure?" Then she closed the journal, put it in the suitcase on top of her folded clothes, and turned out the light. She did not lie awake worrying. She was 93 years old. She had learned the hard way that worry consumed the same hours sleep would have used and left you with considerably less. She slept. The alarm was set for 3:15, but she was awake before it. She turned it off before it sounded and lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the house. It had its own sounds at this hour, small adjustments, and settled murmurs, the particular personality of a structure that had been lived in for 64 years. She knew every one of them. She dressed in the dark without needing the light because she had laid everything out the night before with a methodical care she had inherited from no one and developed entirely on her own. The elastic waist slacks, the navy wool sweater Arthur had given her for her last birthday still in its tissue paper until she had unwrapped it last month and hung it in the closet and chosen it for tonight, deliberately, not practically. She wanted something of his against her skin for this. Her good walking shoes, her coat. She went through the rooms the way she always went through them in her mind when she could not sleep, the inventory a person makes of a life, the catalog of ordinary things made extraordinary by accumulation and time. The kitchen where she had cooked something close to 20,000 meals. The hallway where the children had measured their heights against the door frame for a decade, the pencil marks still faintly visible under the paint Douglas had applied in 1987 when he decided the hall needed freshening. The living room with its bookshelves and its single lamp and the red velvet armchair by the window. She stood in front of the armchair for a moment, put her hand on the armrest. The velvet was worn smooth in the places where she had rested her hands for 34 years, shaped to hers in a way that nothing in Meadowbrook would ever be. She turned away. In the kitchen, she took a single yellow rose from the bunch she had cut from the garden 2 days ago when she had understood that it was time to start saying goodbye in the small ways that did not require words. She filled a short glass with water from the tap and put the rose in it and set it on the kitchen table where Douglas would find it when he came by in the morning. She did not leave a note. The rose said what she needed to say, or it said nothing at all. Either way, it was honest. She picked up her suitcase, unlocked the front door, and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold and clear, the way mountain nights in North Carolina could be, even in the shoulder seasons, the sky overhead crowded with stars in the way city skies never were. She stood on the porch for one breath, just one. Then she walked down the steps and turned toward Haverford Street, pulling her suitcase behind her on the sidewalk, moving through the sleeping neighborhood toward the bus station 6 blocks away. 93 years old, alone in the dark, running away from home. Somewhere around the fourth block, the absurdity of it reached her, and she almost stopped walking. Here she was, a woman who had survived a world war and a second war, and the loss of 2 parents and 3 close friends, and hardest of all, the loss of Arthur, sneaking out of her own house before dawn like a teenager evading a curfew. The image was so precisely ridiculous that something loosened in her chest, something that had been held carefully tight for weeks, and she laughed. Quietly, because it was 4 in the morning and the neighbors' windows were dark, but genuinely from somewhere real. She kept walking. At the corner of Haverford and 2nd, just before the street opened toward downtown, she passed under the oak tree that had been at that corner her entire time on Birchwood Lane, older than she was, older than the neighborhood roots, that had broken the sidewalk twice and been worked around both times because you did not remove something like that. You adjusted your path. She had always liked that about the city. Some things were simply old enough to have earned the right to stay where they were. She reached the bus station at 4 minutes before 5. Inside, the overhead lights had the particular flatness of institutional lighting in the hours before they become anyone's problem, and the rows of plastic seats were mostly empty. A man in work clothes was asleep against his duffel bag near the windows. A young woman with headphones stared at her phone without appearing to see it. Behind the ticket window, a man with reading glasses pushed down his nose, looked up when Eleanor approached. She bought her ticket with character, Birchwood to the Asheville hub, then the connection north. She kept her voice steady and her expression neutral, the same expression she had used in 100 difficult conversations over 93 years. It was the expression of a woman who knows precisely what she is doing and has chosen not to explain it to strangers. She found a seat near the window, set her suitcase beside her, and waited. At 4:58, the bus to the Asheville hub pulled in. At 5 on the dot, it opened its doors. Eleanor stood, picked up her bag, and walked to the door. The driver, young enough to be her grandson, took one look at her suitcase and lifted it into the luggage compartment without being asked. "Heading home or heading out?" he said. It was the kind of thing drivers said when the call had made them conversational. Eleanor considered the question. "Both," she said, and she climbed the steps and found her seat by the window and looked out as the bus reversed and turned and began to move through the dark streets of Asheville, heading north. Behind her, Birchwood Lane was waking up. In a few hours, Douglas would park his car in the driveway and knock on the door of the house on the corner and find it quiet, the lights off, the armchair empty. He would let himself in with the key she knew he had made a copy of without asking her. He would call her name and hear no answer. He would find the rose on the kitchen table single in its glass still fresh and yellow. Eleanor did not allow herself to think about his face when he saw it. She did not allow herself to think about any of their faces. She was not made of stone. She knew what she was doing to them, the fear she was creating, and she carried the weight of that, the way she had carried other necessary difficulties across her life, without denying that it was heavy, without putting it down. The bus moved north. The stars above the Blue Ridge were beginning to dim at their edges, where the sky was very slowly preparing, still hours away, for dawn. Eleanor pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window and watched the dark shapes of the mountains rising up ahead of her, and felt for the first time in 3 years since the morning she had found Arthur in the garden, and understood that the largest part of her life had just ended, the first recognizable signal that something else might be beginning. Not hope exactly. Something quieter than hope and more durable. The feeling of a woman who has made a decision and intends to live with it. The bus moved north, and Eleanor moved with it, and the mountains received her the way old things receive what is coming toward them, without surprise, without ceremony, with only the patient permanence of things that have been waiting a very long time. The phone rang at 6:12 in the morning, somewhere in the darkness between Asheville and the mountains, and Eleanor watched it light up against the fabric of her coat pocket without touching it. Douglas. The name on the screen, backlit and insistent. Then again. Then a third time. She had expected this. She had known when she walked out of the house on Birchwood Lane before dawn that Douglas would come by earlier than agreed, the way people who worry always come earlier than agreed, because worry does not respect schedules. She had estimated 9 o'clock. She had been wrong by nearly 3 hours. She held the phone in both hands and looked at her son's name on the screen, and what she felt was not what she had expected to feel. She had expected relief, the clean relief of a decision made and a bridge burned. What she felt instead was something that surprised her with its force. She loved her son. She loved him plainly and completely, and without reservation, the way you love something you have spent your life helping to exist and not answering him was the hardest single thing she had done since the morning she had found Arthur in the garden and understood she would have to keep breathing without him. The phone went dark, then lit again. She turned it face down in her lap and looked out the window at the passing dark, the highway cutting through the foothills, the first suggestions of the mountains gathering at the edges of the Squinagna. She counted the way Arthur had taught her in the early years when she was prone to outrunning her own thinking. 1, 2, 3. The phone went dark for the last time. She was not a woman who did things without understanding what they cost. She understood exactly what this was costing, and she was paying it anyway. The Asheville hub was a different kind of place at 7 in the morning than it had been at 5, busier and louder. The waiting areas filling with the ordinary commerce of people going somewhere with intent. Eleanor found a seat in the far corner of the second waiting room, away from the main traffic, and bought a cup of coffee from a vending machine that produced something dark and thin and barely warm, nothing like the coffee she made at home, and drank it slowly while she watched the room. She had 3 hours before the connection north. She had brought a paperback, a habit of 40 years, the understanding that time spent waiting was not wasted time if you had a book. She opened it and read the same paragraph 4 times without retaining a word of it, and finally closed it and accepted that her mind was not going to settle into fiction today. She was thinking about the list, not a physical list, the one in her head, the one that had been accumulating for 2 weeks as she prepared. Every way this could go wrong, every point of failure. The bus could be late, the connection could be missed. The cabin could be worse than Arthur's letter had suggested, structurally compromised by 3 years of North Carolina winters. The electricity disconnected the well dry. She could fall. She could become confused. She could arrive at the end of everything she had planned and find nothing waiting for her but her own hubris. She sat with the list the way she had always sat with difficult things, straight-backed, eyes open, not flinching. The list was real. These were real possibilities. Acknowledging them did not make her less capable of continuing. In her experience, the people who refused to acknowledge what could go wrong were precisely the ones it went wrong for. You waiting on the Boone connection. The man who sat down beside her without being invited was large, somewhere in his late 50s, with the particular build of someone who had once been physically powerful and still carried the memory of it in how he held himself. He had a coffee of his own better than hers, from the look of it, from the small cafe near the main entrance. He had a face that had spent time outdoors and a direct quality to his eyes that Eleanor recognized before she had a name for it. Former law enforcement. She had known enough of them over the years. "I am," she said. He nodded, settled back, and she thought that was the end of it. She opened her book again. "Beautiful country up that way," he said. "I'm up near Boone myself. Been down here for a property thing." He looked at her bag, her suitcase, her coat. Not rudely, assessingly. "You got family up there." "I have property," Eleanor said. He raised his eyebrows slightly, the way people do when an answer doesn't fit the box they had already prepared. An old woman traveling alone to remote mountain property was not a category he had apparently been expecting. "Walt Greer," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. "Eleanor Whitfield." "That property been up there long." 40 years, she said. He nodded slowly, doing some arithmetic. "So you know the area?" "Well enough." He was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor thought again that it was finished, and again she was wrong. Walt Greer had the persistence of a man who trusted his instincts. "Heard something on the scanner this morning," he said, and his voice had changed, dropped into something more deliberate. "Before I left, Asheville PD put out a notice. Missing person, elderly woman, Birchwood Lane area." He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at his coffee cup. The waiting room continued its ordinary noise around them. Announcements and rolling luggage and the particular chaos of a transit hub in the morning. Eleanor felt the cold that moved through her as something separate from temperature, something that began in her chest and moved outward, the cold of a planned meeting reality earlier than expected. Douglas had called the police, not at 9 o'clock, before 7 in the morning, which meant he had gone to the house before 7, which meant he had not believed her when she said she needed to sleep late, or he had believed her and gone anyway, because the worry had overridden the instructions and had found the house empty and the rose on the table and had not waited. Walt Greer was still looking at his coffee. "The description," Eleanor said, and her voice came out steady, which was what she had aimed for. "I imagine it could fit a great many women of a certain age." "It could," Walt agreed. She looked at him directly. He was a man who had spent his career looking at people and deciding things about them, and she was 93 years old and had spent her career doing something not entirely different, which was watching people carefully and understanding what they needed before they said it. "I know what I'm doing," she said. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he was deciding how to handle this, running through the options the way his training had built into him. Long enough that she took a slow breath and prepared herself for the conversation that would follow if he reached for his phone. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "You leaving a bad situation or going towards something?" She considered the question the way it deserved. "Going toward," she said, "something my husband left me, something that belongs to me." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Once, twice. Then he put it down. "My wife," he said and stopped. Started again. "She passed 4 years ago. She had a place she loved up in Watauga County, her family's old land. When she got sick, her sister decided she needed to be closer to the hospital. Better care." His jaw moved slightly. "She died in a room that wasn't hers, surrounded by people doing their best, but not in the place she would have chosen." Eleanor did not say anything. She understood that he was not asking for her response. "I think about that," Walt said, "a lot." She put her paper back in her bag and stood up slowly, the joints in her knees making their morning complaints, and picked up her purse. The announcement for her connection had not come yet, but she was ready to move toward the gate. "Thank you for the conversation, Mr. Greer," she said. He nodded once, looking at the middle distance. She walked toward the gate without looking back. She did not hear him reach for his phone. She counted her steps instead, even and steady on the terminal floor. And when she reached the gate and found her seat in the next row of plastic chairs and looked up at the departure board and saw the Boone connection listed on time, she permitted herself one quiet breath of something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. She did not see Walt Greer again in the terminal. What she did not know and would not know for some weeks was that he sat in that corner for another 20 minutes after she walked away, looking at his phone and then put it in his jacket pocket without making a call. What she did not know was that the reason he did not call was a reason he could not entirely have named, except that the woman had looked at him with the eyes of someone who knew the exact dimensions of what she was doing, and in his experience, which was considerable, that was not what a person in danger looked like. That was what a person in motion looked like. The bus to Boone climbed. That was the word for what it did not traveled or moved, but climbed the road, narrowing and steepening as the mountains stopped being a backdrop and became the world itself. Eleanor had forgotten in the 3 years she had not let herself think about this place how the Blue Ridge received you. Not gently, not with the accommodating softness of landscape designed for tourism. It had its own weather, its own silence, its own schedule, and it made no accommodation for whatever you brought with you. She had always respected that about it. The other passengers on the bus were few. A college-age boy with earphones. 2 women who appeared to be together, talking quietly. A man about Douglas's age asleep against the window with his mouth open. Eleanor watched the trees thicken and the sky drop lower as the elevation rose, and she thought about Arthur. He had loved this drive. He had always been the one driving in the years they had made this trip together, and she had been the one watching the landscape change, and he would not have tolerated silence for long before he started pointing things out, that particular ridge, that formation of rock where the road cut through the hillside, a hawk circling something in the valley below. He had a naturalist's attention without a naturalist's vocabulary, which meant he described everything precisely and named almost nothing correctly, and she had loved him for it with a consistency that had never required effort. In Boone, she needed a taxi. The town was larger than it had been 40 years ago, which was also true of most places, and the cab stand outside the bus terminal had 2 cars waiting. She chose the nearer one and opened the rear door herself before the driver had fully registered her approach. He was younger than Patrick, with the particular look of someone who had arrived in this part of the country from somewhere very different and was still orienting. He looked at her, then at the suitcase she was maneuvering toward the trunk, and got out of the car and took it from her without being asked. "Where to?" he said. She gave him the address from the property deed, the rural route number, and the marker description Arthur had written in the letter. The driver looked at it the way people look at directions to places they know to be genuinely remote. "That's up past the forest boundary," he said, "pretty far out. Last winter there was a tree across the access road. Don't know if it's been cleared." "Can you get there?" He thought about it. "Yeah, I can get there." He looked at her again, not with the suspicious assessment of Walt Greer, but with something younger and more simply concerned. There's no cell service past the 7th-mile marker. You know that, Quim? I know that, she said. He held open the rear door. She got in. He got in. His name, she learned in the way you learn things during long drives, was Ray Kowalski. He was 34 years old from outside Chicago, and he had moved to Boone 18 months ago after his wife died of an illness that had taken 11 months from diagnosis to end. He was learning woodworking in the evenings because, as he said it, making something with your hands was the only activity that required enough attention to prevent thinking about other things. He did not offer this information in a single organized speech. It came out in pieces over 40 minutes of mountain road prompted by her questions because Eleanor had always understood that the best way to occupy a long ride was to be genuinely interested in the person driving. "You running from something," he said about 20 minutes in. The way he said it was not accusatory. It was the question of someone young enough to still be direct about the things he wanted to know. "I'm not running from anything," she said. "I'm going somewhere I belong." He was quiet for a moment, navigating a curve where the road had narrowed to one lane. "I had a place like that," he said, "before." He did not specify before what. He did not need to. "A lake in Wisconsin my grandfather owned. I always thought I'd go back there eventually. Then everything changed and I just never went." "Why not?" she said. He shrugged his shoulders, rising and falling in a way that contained more than the gesture. Felt like it would hurt too much. Being there without the people it was supposed to be with. Eleanor looked out the window at the trees, the road climbing toward the high terrain where the cabin waited, and said, "I understand that. I haven't been back in 3 years, for the same reason." "And now?" "And now," she said, "the alternative hurts more." Ray Kowalski thought about this for the remaining 20 minutes of the drive. She could see it in the way he held the wheel, the particular quality of silence that is not emptiness but processing. When the dirt access road appeared off the left side of the paved route, marked by nothing but the post with the faded number that Arthur had set in concrete in 1983, Ray turned without hesitation. The car moved slowly up the rutted track through trees so close on both sides that the branches touched overhead, in places making a tunnel of early afternoon light. And then the trees opened, and the cabin was there. Eleanor had been prepared for this moment, or thought she had been, but preparation turned out to be insufficient. The cabin sat at the edge of the cleared land, the way Arthur had placed it oriented, to catch the morning light through the east-facing windows, the structure small and deliberate, and still, after 3 years of absence, entirely itself. The wood had weathered. The porch boards would need attention. One shutter was slightly off its mount, but it was standing. Of course it was standing. Arthur had built it to last. Ray stopped the car and got out, and stood looking at it the way a young man who has been learning woodworking will look at something built by a craftsman with a professional attention to the details of construction. "Who built this?" he said. "My husband," Eleanor said. Ray was quiet for a moment. He lifted her suitcase from the trunk and carried it to the foot of the porch steps. Then he looked at the roof line, the way the rafters met at the peak, the joints visible where the porch overhang met the exterior wall. "He loved you," Ray said. It was not a sentimental observation, it was a technical one. "You can see it in the work, the way someone builds when they're building for keeps." Eleanor stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked at the cabin and felt something move through her that she did not try to name. "Yes," she said, "he did." Ray wrote his phone number on the back of a receipt from the console of his car and handed it to her. "If you need someone to bring supplies up, I don't need to know why, I just need to know where." She took it. She looked at him for a moment, this young man who had lost something and was trying to rebuild himself with his hands, who had driven her up a mountain road without demanding explanations, and had understood the cabin better than her own children would. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in more ways than she said. She watched his car navigate the access road back toward the trees, and then she was alone. Completely, entirely alone for the first time in weeks, possibly months. The silence of the mountains settling around her like something physical. The afternoon birds in the trees and the wind moving through the high pines and nothing else. She climbed the porch steps one at a time, her knees arguing her hand on the railing. Arthur had built solid enough that it had not moved in 40 years. She put the iron key in the lock. It turned without resistance. Of course it did. The first day she slept. She did not intend to. She intended to assess the cabin, open the windows, understand what needed attention. Instead, she sat down on the edge of the bed after a few minutes, and the next thing she knew, the light through the windows had gone from afternoon yellow to the flat gray of early evening, and her body had simply taken what it needed without consulting her preferences. She was 93 years old, and she had traveled several hundred miles alone on public transportation, and the body had opinions. The second day she worked, slowly with frequent rests, the way you work when the work is important and the engine available for it is limited. She opened every window. She swept the main room and the kitchen. She washed the accumulated dust from the surfaces with a cloth and the well water, which ran clear and cold when she turned the tap as Arthur had promised it would. She brought in wood from under the tarp beside the house. She determined that the electricity was connected, the propane tank sufficient, the generator functional. 3 sentences for 3 discoveries, each one a small confirmation of a promise kept across 3 years of death. The third morning, she woke unable to sit up for nearly 10 minutes. This was not new. Her joints had been demanding their morning tribute for years, the stiffness that required patience in a deliberate sequence of small movements before the body would agree to function. She had learned to give it the time it needed without catastrophizing about what it meant. But this morning the joints were angrier than usual, the travel and the unaccustomed physical work of the day before having registered their complaint, and she lay flat on her back, looking up at the ceiling of the cabin bedroom, and felt for the first time since leaving Birchwood Lane the full weight of what she had done. She was 93 years old. She was alone on a mountain. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles up the road. There was no cell service. She reached for the bedside glass of water and knocked it over, and it fell to the floor and didn't break but rolled under the bed, and she lay there looking at the ceiling and thought with a clarity that was not comfortable. What if Douglas was right? Not about Meadowbrook, not about the decision-making that had been stripped from her without consultation, but about the fundamental fact he kept circling. She was 93 years old and living alone in a remote place, and one serious fall, one cardiac event, one night of real confusion, and no one would know. She lay with this. She did not push it away. Pushing it away would have been dishonest, and Eleanor did not allow herself the relief of dishonesty about important things. What she concluded after several minutes of sealing and genuine reckoning was this: the risk was real. And she was choosing it anyway, not because she did not understand it, because she understood it and had weighed it against the alternative, and the alternative was worse. To be safe in Meadowbrook in a room that was not hers under a schedule she had not chosen, surrounded by people paid to manage her, was a kind of slow erasure that she was not willing to undergo. She would rather risk the fall. She would rather risk the night alone with no one coming. She reached down carefully, took hold of the side of the mattress, and pulled herself to sitting in stages the way she had learned to do it. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, breathing. Then she reached for the bottle of morning medications in the bag on the nightstand and stopped. There were 2 bottles there. She looked at them. The labels were similar in format, though different in color, and in the dim light of a mountain morning coming through dusty windows, she was not certain which was which. She reached for the nearer one and then made herself stop again and reach for her reading glasses first, because the lesson of the reading glasses was one she had learned 30 years ago and did not need to relearn at 93. And when she put them on, she saw that the bottle she had nearly opened first was the sleep medication, not the blood pressure prescription. She put the sleep medication back. She sat very still on the edge of the bed. She was not frightened exactly. What she felt was more specific than fear. It was the recognition of her own limitations meeting the reality of her situation, the way 2 things that had been kept apart finally come into contact. She had planned for this trip with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and she had not been thorough enough about this particular morning, about the light and the unfamiliar nightstand, and the 2 bottles so similar in size. She thought about Douglas. She thought about the version of him that would say, "This is exactly what I meant." She thought, yes, and I'm still here. I caught it. She opened the right bottle and took her medication with water from the second glass she had remembered to fill the night before, and she sat on the edge of the bed until her knees agreed to carry her, and then she stood up and went to the kitchen and put on the coffee. She was still scared. She was also still here. Both things were equally true, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. On the 5th day, in the bottom drawer of the dresser in the bedroom, wrapped carefully in a sleeve of oilcloth that had preserved it against 3 years of mountain humidity, Eleanor found the metal box. She recognized Arthur's handwriting on the note taped to the lid before she had fully registered that the box was locked, before she had noticed that the key was taped beside the note, before she had understood what she was holding. The handwriting said, "For Eleanor when you come home." She carried the box to the kitchen table the way she carried irreplaceable things with both hands and complete attention. The key was small and fit the lock precisely, the mechanism turning with the ease of something maintained and oiled in advance. Inside, arranged with the orderly care of a man who had thought about this moment for years, were three items. First, the property deed, the original in her name, Eleanor May Dawson. The name she had not gone by in 65 years, still real on the legal paper, still hers. Second, a sheaf of bank documents, statements from a trust account in her name through the offices of Gerald Sutton, attorney at law. She did not look at the number for more than a moment because the number was large enough to be disorienting, and she needed to read the letter before she could properly absorb anything else. Third, the letter. It was written on 4 pages of the heavy cream paper Arthur had always preferred for anything he considered important. The handwriting pressed slightly harder than his ordinary hand, the way his handwriting always did when he was writing something he had thought about for a long time. "My Elliot," began. She had to stop there. 2 words and she had to stop. She put the letter on the table and removed her reading glasses and pressed the back of her hand briefly against her eyes, not crying, or not only crying but processing something that was not purely grief. Something that was grief folded around gratitude, folded around a love so specific and so durable that it had survived his death and was still operating, still making arrangements, still thinking about what she needed. She put her glasses back on. She read, "He wrote about the cabin, the 40 years of taxes paid, the trust structure, the way Gerald Sutton had instructions to ensure her access to the funds for as long as she lived. He wrote about the children with a clarity that was loving and unsentimental. He knew them. He wrote the way you know people you raised, which meant knowing their capabilities and their limits and the exact ways their love could become a trap if you let it. He was not angry at them for what they would do. He had simply decided to give her a way around it." Then he wrote about 1975. She had not known he was going to write about 1975. He wrote that he had never forgiven himself for the years he had not seen the notebook in the kitchen drawer and for the way her exhaustion had been invisible to him because he had been too consumed by his own fear of failing to look carefully at her. He wrote that finding the notebook had been one of the most significant moments of his life, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented, how much she had been carrying that he had not thought to ask about. He wrote that the question he had started asking that year every evening was not an apology. He could not apologize for 3 years of not seeing because he could not undo them. The question was a commitment. It was the closest he knew how to come to a promise that he would not stop looking. And then the line that made her put the letter down for the second time. "I know you've been answering fine for so long that it probably sounds true to you by now. It isn't. You are not a woman who has ever been merely fine. You are the most complete person I have ever known, and I built this place for you because you deserve somewhere that is entirely yours. Not mine, not theirs, yours." She sat at the kitchen table of the cabin Arthur had built with his hands and read her husband's understanding of her and felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a name for and did not need one. Beneath the 3 items she had already found, she now saw, as she moved the papers aside, a fourth. A photograph. Small, black and white, the borders slightly curled. She picked it up and looked at it. 2 people standing in front of a structure that was recognizably the cabin, though unfinished, the exterior walls, incomplete scaffolding, visible on the right side. The year in Arthur's handwriting on the back, 1982. The man in the photograph was Arthur, 20 years younger than she had known him at the inn, standing with the particular posture of a man at a construction site. He has made significant progress on, tired and satisfied in the way physical work produces. The woman beside him was Eleanor, 41 years ago, her hand on his arm. Both of them were laughing. She could not remember looking at the photograph what they had been laughing about. Something in the ordinary way of things, the accumulated humor of a shared life. Something that had not seemed worth recording, but that Arthur had thought to photograph anyway, because he was a man who understood that ordinary moments were what life was actually made of. She turned the photograph over. Beneath the date in smaller letters, "The first day of ours." She held the photograph and understood fully now what the cabin had always been. Not a retreat, not a backup plan, not a provision against eventual difficulty. It had been from the first day Arthur set the corner post a declaration. A place he was building not as a contractor building for a client, but as a man building for the woman he intended to spend his life with, a physical expression of the belief that she deserved somewhere entirely her own. He had not built this because he had anticipated losing her. He had built it because he had understood her. There was a difference so significant that she sat with it for a long time in the mountain quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon was making its slow progress toward evening, the light changing its angle through the trees, the way mountain light did specifically and beautifully in ways that were not visible from valleys. She put the photograph carefully with the other items in the box. Then she looked at the fourth item she had nearly missed tucked beneath the bank papers in the back corner. A smaller envelope, her name on the front and beneath it in capital letters, "Open when Douglas comes." She stared at this for a long time. Arthur had known Douglas would come. Of course he had. He had known all of it. He had left a letter specifically for that confrontation sealed, waiting as patient as the cabin itself had been waiting for the moment when it would be needed. She did not open it. Her name was on the outer envelope, but the inner flap was sealed, addressed to her children, and she understood that what it contained was not for her first. It was for them. Arthur had been making decisions quietly for 65 years. He was still making them. She put the small sealed envelope in the pocket of the cardigan she had been wearing for 3 days and left it there. Outside, the Blue Ridge evening was beginning its slow performance, the temperature dropping, the first stars visible above the ridgeline to the east. Eleanor stood on the porch with her coffee gone cold in her hands and looked at the mountains that had been here before this country had a name for itself, and felt for the first time in 3 years something she had stopped expecting. Not happiness exactly. Something that preceded happiness and made it possible. The feeling of being where she was supposed to be in a place that had been waiting for her in a life that still had the quality of belonging to her. She went inside. She locked the door. She turned on the lamp Arthur had wired himself in 1984, and it cast its warm circle of light across the room, the way it had always cast it, unchanged and patient. She did not know yet that in 48 hours, Walt Greer would appear at the edge of her property with an expression that meant he had been thinking about her since the bus station. She did not know yet what he would say or what she would say in return, or that the document in the metal box would be the instrument by which a standoff would resolve itself. What she knew sitting in the cabin Arthur had built for her with his hands and his love, and his 40-year confidence that she would one day need it, was that Douglas was coming. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not the day after, but he was coming, and when he arrived, he was going to find not a confused old woman who had wandered into danger. He was going to find his mother, exactly where she had chosen to be. She put the metal box on the shelf where she could see it from the chair by the window. Then she sat down and looked out at the mountain dark and waited for whatever was coming next, with the calm of a woman who had stopped running and started arriving. Gerald Sutton had been Arthur Whitfield's attorney for 22 years, and he was, by his own assessment, a man of considerable professional composure. He had delivered estate news to grieving families, negotiated contentious property disputes, and once informed a sitting county commissioner that his business arrangements constituted fraud in a way that would require immediate remedy. He had done all of this without losing his characteristic steadiness. Douglas Whitfield made him feel, for the first time in a long career, genuinely cornered. They were in Sutton's office on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Eleanor had disappeared from Birchwood Lane, and Douglas had brought a police report, a notarized statement from a geriatric physician, and the specific legal energy of a man who had been practicing law for 35 years and understood exactly which pressure points were available to him. "She is my client," Sutton said. He said it the third time with the same evenness he had used the first 2 times, because that was the only ground available to him, and he intended to hold it. "She is a 93-year-old woman who has been missing for 11 days, Douglas said. "If you have information about her whereabouts and you withhold it from her family and from the police, I will have your license reviewed before the end of the month." Sutton looked at the man across his desk, this 68-year-old son, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the particular combination of genuine fear and procedural aggression that Sutton had seen before in people who did not know how to feel their way through something without converting it into a problem that could be managed with tools. He thought about Arthur. He thought about the specific instructions Arthur had given him in 2019 when the trust documents were finalized, sitting in the same office in that same chair. "She'll come to the cabin eventually," Arthur had said. "When she does, I want her left alone for as long as she wants. But if the kids push hard enough, you can give them the address. The rest I've handled." "There is a property," Sutton said carefully, "in the Blue Ridge outside Boone. The title is in your mother's name, her maiden name, held in trust since 1982. She has full legal right to be there. She is not missing Mr. Whitfield. She is at home." The silence that followed was complicated. In the backseat of Douglas's car on the road north, Patrick read aloud from the single page Sutton had provided the address in a paragraph of summary, and when he finished reading, he folded it along its original crease and looked out the window at the mountains beginning to appear on the horizon. Caroline was in the passenger seat. She had not spoken since they left Sutton's office. Douglas drove with both hands on the wheel. No music, no podcast, the particular silence of a man processing information that has restructured what he thought he understood. Patrick watched his brother's reflection in the window glass. He had known Douglas for 59 years, which was the entirety of his own life and most of Douglas's, and he had spent most of those years finding ways to navigate around his oldest brother rather than through him. Douglas was certain the way granite was certain. He did not revise easily. But Patrick had been watching him for 11 days now, since the morning Douglas had called him at 6:45 to say that their mother's house was empty and the rose was on the table, and what he had seen during those 11 days was something he had not expected to see in Douglas, a man frightened in a way that had nothing to do with the practical. Douglas had filed the police report and contacted the hospitals and driven the roads around Asheville in expanding circles and organized the search with the competence he brought to everything, and underneath all of it, underneath every procedural action, was the face of a son who could not stop seeing his father on his knees in the garden. That was the thing no one had said. That was the thing they had all been carrying for 3 years, the four of them, in their different ways. She planned this, Carolyn said finally to the windshield. Yes, Douglas said, for weeks, while we were visiting, while we were talking about Meadowbrook. She stopped. While I was feeling good about how she seemed to be accepting things. No one added to this? The road climbed. Walt Greer had come the second time on a Tuesday, 8 days after the first visit, and he had come differently. The first time he had stood at the edge of Eleanor's property with the stance of a man asserting a position, and she had brought the deed to the table with the same composure she had brought to every negotiation in her life that involved someone underestimating her. He had looked at the documents and left without conceding anything verbally, which was what men like Walt Greer did. When they lost an argument, they went quiet and they went away, and you learned something about them from what they did next. What he did next 8 days later was arrive at her door with a set of gate hinges in a paper bag and the information that the right side of her entry gate was going to fail before the first hard frost. He had not knocked. He had called from the foot of the porch steps, "Eleanor, the gate. I'm putting new hinges on." She had looked up from the kitchen table where she was writing in her journal and considered this for a moment. Then she had called back, "There's coffee." He had fixed the hinges in 40 minutes, working with the economy of a man who had done this kind of work all his life. And then he had come onto the porch and stood at the railing with the coffee she brought out. And they had talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. The weather coming in from the west, the deer that had been at her garden, the road conditions on the county route after rain. It was the conversation of neighbors. Not new neighbors finding each other out, but established ones confirming what was already known. He had not asked her about the bus station. She had not brought it up. Some things once settled did not need to be revisited. Eleanor was in the garden when Douglas's car came up the access road. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of a vehicle that was not Ray's truck or the delivery services van, something heavier and moving with the particular speed of people who have driven a long distance and are close to the end of it. She straightened from the row of late-season greens she had been tending, removed her gardening gloves and stood in the afternoon light with the mountains at her back and watched her oldest son's black SUV emerge from the tree line into the clearing. She had been expecting this. She had been expecting it since the morning she put the sealed envelope in the pocket of her cardigan. She had been ready for it the way you are ready for something you have thought about from every angle and made your decisions about in advance, not without fear. She had learned in 93 years that readiness and fear were not opposites. You could be completely prepared and still feel the cold along your spine when the moment arrived. Douglas got out first. He was wearing the jacket he wore to his weekend house, the practical one, rather than the courtroom one, which meant he had dressed for this, had thought about how he wanted to present himself, and had chosen approachability over authority. She noticed this. She filed it without comment. Caroline came around from the passenger side and Patrick from the back, and the three of them stood by the car for a moment looking at her, and Eleanor looked back and nobody spoke. They looked, she thought, the way people look after 11 days of being frightened for someone. Even Douglas, who had the professional facility of a man trained to control the presentation of his inner states. Underneath the set of his jaw was something exhausted and relieved and still not entirely believing what his eyes were telling him. "Would you like to come in?" Eleanor said. It was not quite a question. Douglas opened his mouth. She watched him stop himself from the first thing he had been going to say, which she could tell by the particular way his jaw reclosed was something that would not have served either of them. "Please," he said instead. They came in. Eleanor went to the kitchen and put on water for coffee the way she had done in every significant moment of her life, because the ritual of it gave people somewhere to put their hands in their eyes while they found their way into the conversation they needed to have. She heard them behind her moving through the cabin. She did not turn around. She let them look. Patrick was the quietest. He had always processed things by moving through them physically rather than speaking about them, and she could hear him walking slowly, the particular sound of footsteps that are not going anywhere, but are covering ground anyway the way his father had moved when he was thinking. "Mom," Douglas said. He was standing in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen. His voice had lost something since the driveway, some of the prepared quality replaced by something less rehearsed. "You have no idea, 11 days. We called every hospital in 3 counties. "I know," Eleanor said. She poured the water. "I'm sorry for the fear. I am not sorry for the decision. You couldn't have called once just to say you were safe." She turned and looked at her oldest son and said the thing she had been preparing to say for 11 days without anger, because this was not about anger. "If I had called, you would have come immediately to bring me back. I needed time to be here before you arrived. I needed to know for myself that I could do this, that I was right about what I needed. You would have taken that from me even trying to help." Douglas was quiet. The water poured into the cups. "There's something," she said, "that your father left for you." She reached into the drawer where she had moved the sealed envelope from her cardigan the previous week, and she carried it to the table and set it in front of the chair she was pointing Douglas toward. "He wrote it before he died. He knew this day would come. He wanted you to hear from him, not just from me." Douglas looked at the envelope, the way people look at things they are not sure they want to open the name on it, in his father's handwriting. This proof that his father had been making plans that none of them had known about, had been thinking about all of them, and none of them had known. "Sit down," Eleanor said, not unkindly. "Both of you." She set coffee in front of each of them and sat at the head of the table in the chair that faced the window in the mountains and waited. Douglas read the letter without speaking. His hands did not move. He held it flat on the table and read it the way he would read a deposition, carefully and completely, and Eleanor watched his face. She saw the moment when he reached the part about himself. His expression did not change on the surface, but something behind his eyes shifted, a subtle recalibration. The internal equivalent of a man who has walked into a room expecting one thing and found another. He finished the letter. He folded it back along its creases with more care than the situation strictly required, the care of a man doing something with his hands because he needs a moment before he speaks. He passed it to Caroline. Caroline read differently. She read the way she had always read things that moved her, with her whole face, her expression changing openly as she moved through the pages, and Eleanor saw the moment 3/4 of the way down the second page when she stopped. She did not say anything. She put the letter on the table in front of her and pressed her hands flat on either side of it, as though to keep it from moving. "He wrote my name," Caroline said. "Yes," Eleanor said. He knew. He knew it would be me with the brochures. He knew all of you," Eleanor said. "He loved all of you." Both things were true. Caroline looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying yet, or was choosing not to, which with Caroline had always amounted to the same thing. "He said I show love with preparation, with planning, that I organize things for people because it makes me feel like I'm protecting them." She stopped. "He wasn't wrong." "No," Eleanor said. "He wasn't. But I organized you," Caroline said, "without asking you. I put together the folder and the timeline and the deposit, and I thought I was loving you, and I was." She stopped again. "I was just doing it entirely for myself." Patrick had taken the letter when Caroline set it down and was reading it standing at the kitchen window, his back to the table. Eleanor watched him. She had always known Patrick understood things differently than his siblings, sideways, and through his hands rather than directly, and through argument, and she waited for him to finish in his own time. He put the letter on the counter and stood at the window for a while. Then he walked out the back door without saying anything. Douglas watched him go. He looked at Eleanor with a question in his expression. "Let him," she said. She looked at her oldest son across the kitchen table, the son who had his father's jaw and his grandfather's stubbornness, and somewhere under both of those, the fear that had been running his decisions for 3 years. "I need to say something to you," she said, "and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond." Douglas put his hands flat on the table, a posture she recognized. It was the posture he used in depositions when he was choosing to listen rather than object. She had always been glad he had become a lawyer. He was good at it. "You sat in your father's chair," she said, "the day of the meeting. You sat in it without thinking the way you would sit in it if it were already yours. And I understood in that moment that somewhere you had started to think of me the same way. Not as a person with a life of her own, as something that would pass to you in the ordinary course of things. Something to be managed responsibly until it no longer required managing." Douglas said nothing. His jaw was tight. "I know that is not what you intended," she said. "I know you were frightened. I know what it looked like when your father died, and I know that every time you thought about me in that house alone, you saw the garden and him on his knees, and the fact that you were not there. I know this because I know you. I carried it too." Something in Douglas's face moved. "But your fear," she said, "is not my responsibility to resolve by giving up my life. I am your mother. I am not your problem." She watched Douglas Whitfield, 68 years old, the man she had watched learn to walk on the kitchen floor of the house on Birchwood Lane, look at his hands on the table. And she watched him do something she had not seen him do since he was small. He did not argue. He did not construct a response. He sat with what she had said and let it be true. "Dad's letter," he said finally. His voice was different now, lower. "He said we had forgotten that you were a person before you were our mother, that you would still be a person after we were done needing you to be." He stopped. "He said if we forced you into a place you hadn't chosen, we would be taking from you the thing he'd spent 65 years trying to give you." He looked up. He was right. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I don't know how to stop being afraid," Douglas said. And the simplicity of it, the plain, honest difficulty of it, made Eleanor reach across the table and put her hand over his, the way Arthur had put his hand over hers in 1975 at the kitchen table of a different house in a different decade when the conversation that needed to happen had finally started happening. "I know," she said. "You don't have to stop. You just have to stop letting it make decisions for me." Outside the window, Patrick was in the garden. She watched him through the glass. He had found the hand trowel she kept on the edge of the raised bed, and he was clearing the weeds that had come up around the late-season plantings, working carefully and with attention the way you work in someone else's garden when you understand it matters to them. He had not been asked. He had not announced what he was doing. He had simply gone out and started. Caroline saw her watching. She turned and looked through the glass too. "That's how he apologizes," Caroline said softly. "I know," Eleanor said. "He gets that from his father." Walt Greer appeared at the foot of the porch steps at 4 in the afternoon as the shadows from the western ridge were beginning to reach toward the clearing, and he had a paper bag in one hand and the specific bearing of a man who has assessed a situation from a distance and decided to approach it directly. Douglas was on the porch. He had come out 20 minutes earlier after the conversation in the kitchen had run its course, and all of them needed the particular relief of open air. He was standing at the porch railing, looking at the mountains with an expression Eleanor recognized as the expression of a man revising a significant number of his assumptions. Walt stopped at the foot of the steps. He looked at Douglas with the flat assessment Eleanor had first seen in the bus station. "Neighbor," he said simply. Then he looked past Douglas to Eleanor in the doorway. "Eleanor, brought the stakes for the garden fence. Deer will be worse when the cold moves in." "Thank you, Walt," Eleanor said. "You can leave them in the shed." He nodded. He carried the bag around the side of the house without another word. Douglas watched him go. He watched the way Walt moved around the property with the ease of someone who had been here before, who knew where the shed was, who did not need to be shown. He watched Eleanor in the doorway, the way she had acknowledged the man, and directed him without any of the particular performance of an old woman managing a favor, just the plain ease of a neighbor receiving what neighbors do for each other. He was quiet for a long time after Walt disappeared around the corner. "How long has he been coming around?" Douglas said. "A few weeks," Eleanor said. "He just shows up and does things." "We had a disagreement early on," she said, "about the property line. I showed him the deed. After that, yes, he shows up and does things." She watched her son's face. "There's also a doctor in Boone, Franklin Webb. He does home visits for patients in the rural areas. He's been out twice. And a woman named Judy Hartwell who manages the grocery delivery service. She stays for coffee." Douglas turned from the railing to look at her fully. I'm not alone up here because I'm isolated, Eleanor said. I'm alone up here because I chose to be. Those are different conditions. She watched her oldest son, the man who had spent 11 days imagining her helpless and frightened and lost, stand on her porch and understand that she had been none of those things, that the emergency he had been managing had never existed in the form he had imagined it, that his mother had arrived in this place and built in a matter of weeks exactly the life she had said she was capable of building. He looked out at the mountains. She let him look. I don't know how to visit you here, he said finally. I don't mean the drive. I mean, I don't know how to come here and just be your son without auditing everything, without running the checklist in my head. You'll learn, she said. We'll both have to. Patrick found it on his third visit 6 weeks later. He had been coming up every 3 weeks since the afternoon in the garden each time with some pretext of practical purpose that fooled no one. The first time a box of supplies he had overloaded deliberately to have an excuse to stay for dinner. The second time a concern about the weatherproofing on the south-facing window that he spent 4 hours addressing with a thoroughness the window probably had not required. The third time he brought his woodworking tools. He said he wanted to look at the porch boards that had started showing wear. Eleanor said nothing and let him do what he needed to do, which was what she had always done with Patrick. He was in the storage room off the back of the cabin looking for the wood sealer she had told him was on the second shelf when he went still. She was at the kitchen table when she heard him stop moving in the back room. She knew the particular quality of that silence, the silence of a person who has encountered something unexpected and is standing very still with it. After a minute, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had a look on his face that she had not seen since he was a child, the look of someone who has been told something they did not know and is still absorbing what it changes. There's a chair, he said. Yes, she said. In the back room, unfinished. Red oak from the look of it. He stopped. Mom, the proportions, the way the back is shaped. It's the same as the chair in the living room at Birchwood, the red velvet one. Yes, she said again. He was building a pair, Patrick said. He was building one for here. He didn't finish it, Eleanor said. He got sick before he could. Patrick leaned in the doorway with his arms crossed and his carpenter's mind running through what he had seen in the back room. She could see him doing it. There are measurements, he said, penciled on the seat blank. The proportions are all there. Someone who knew what they were doing could finish it from what he left. Eleanor looked at her youngest son. She looked at the man Arthur had known, would understand the cabin from the inside, who would find the chair, the way a person finds something they were meant to find, not by searching, but by being in the right place at the right time with the right kind of attention. I know, she said. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face, not grief exactly, but grief's first cousin. The feeling you get when you understand that someone loved you in ways they never told you directly, that evidence of the love keeps appearing after they are gone. He knew you'd come here, Patrick said. He was getting the chair ready for you. That was your father, Eleanor said. He was always getting things ready, ahead of what anyone could see coming. Patrick looked at the mountains through the kitchen window. The way they all looked at the mountains, eventually the way this place seemed to invite it. The light in the late afternoon had taken on the quality it always had in October, lower and more golden, catching the colors in the ridgeline. I want to finish it, Patrick said. If you'd let me, I want to finish the chair. Eleanor looked at her son. She thought about Arthur at 35, building this cabin on the weekends with his hands and his plans and his confidence that Eleanor would one day need somewhere entirely her own. She thought about the man who had left instructions with his attorney and a letter in a metal box and a sealed envelope for his children and a half-finished chair in the back room, all of it arranged in advance, all of it waiting. Your father would have liked that, she said. Patrick nodded once the way his father had nodded when something was settled. He called Douglas that evening from the porch, and Eleanor could hear his voice through the window, low and direct. He told Douglas about the chair. He told him what he wanted to do. She heard Douglas's response through the quality of Patrick's silence, the kind of silence that means someone is listening to something that is landing. We should all come up, Patrick said. Make a weekend of it. Help finish what he started. 3 months after Eleanor arrived at the cabin on an evening in late November, when the first hard frost had come and gone, and the garden had gone to ground for the winter, Douglas called on a Wednesday. This was new. Not the call itself, he had been calling on Wednesdays since October, but the content of this one was different from the ones before it. He did not ask about her medications. He did not ask whether she had fallen or whether she was eating. He called and told her about a case he was working on, a complicated property matter, involving three competing heirs in a deed with an ambiguous clause, and partway through the description he stopped and said, "What would you do if you were the mediator?" Eleanor sat in the chair by the window, with the mountains dark outside and the lamp making its circle of warm light across the floor the way Arthur had designed it to, and she thought about the question seriously and told Douglas what she thought. He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's what I thought too, but I wasn't sure." A beat. "Mom, you have good instincts." "I know," she said. "I've always known." She heard him on the other end of the line in his house in Asheville, and she thought about the 64 years it had taken to get to a Wednesday evening phone call where her oldest son asked her opinion and meant it. She did not feel bitter about the time it had taken. Bitterness was a way of staying in the past, and Eleanor had never been interested in the past as a place to live. Caroline sent a package on a Thursday which arrived with the Judy Hartwell delivery, a flat box with tissue paper inside, and when Eleanor opened it, she found packets of bulbs, tulips, crocuses, a paper bag of small iris corms with a note tucked inside in Caroline's handwriting. "For spring, I asked Judy what grows well up there. She said anything you put your hands on." I believe her. Eleanor held the bag of bulbs and thought about the garden she would plant in the spring, the colors that would come up along the south face of the cabin in April, the first growing season, that was entirely hers to choose. She wrote back a single line, "Orange and yellow. Your father always said those were the ones that looked like they meant it." The chair was finished on the first weekend in December. Patrick brought it in the back of his truck, the pieces wrapped in moving blankets, Douglas and Caroline beside him, all three of them treating the transportation of it with the care of people carrying something irreplaceable, which it was. They assembled it on the porch in the cold morning, Patrick directing the process, Douglas holding pieces in place with a patience he had been practicing, Caroline sitting on the porch steps watching with her coffee in both hands. It took 2 hours. The red oak had darkened slightly in the years it had been waiting in the back room, which Patrick said was fine, was expected, was in fact better, because it would match the way aged wood matched him perfectly and honestly. When it was done, they carried it inside and set it at the window beside the chair Eleanor had been using since she arrived. She stood looking at the two chairs side by side in the morning light, the old one she had brought nothing of except the habit of sitting in it, and the one Arthur had been making for her, finished now by the son who had his father's hands. Patrick said he would have wanted to do it himself. He knew he might not be able to, Eleanor said. That's why he left the measurements. She sat in it. The proportions were Arthur's proportions, the height and angle he would have known without measuring, because he had built chairs for 60 years and understood by this point how a human body wanted to rest. It fit her the way things fit when they were made for you, specifically not the generic fit of something designed for a category of person, but the precise fit of something built with one person in mind. She put her hands on the armrests. Outside the window, the December mountains were bare and gray, and entirely themselves, the Blue Ridge in winter stripped of its summer prettiness, and left with the thing underneath it, the old, enduring bones of the land. Douglas was standing near the back wall, his hands in his jacket pockets, watching her. She looked at him and saw on his face something she had been waiting 3 months to see, not the arranged concern of a son managing a situation, but something simpler and older than that. The face of a man looking at his mother and seeing her. "It's right, isn't it?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said, "it's right." They stayed for the weekend, all three of them sleeping on the old beds, and the pull-out couch filling the cabin with noise and argument, and the particular warmth of a family that has come through something and knows it. Patrick made breakfast on Saturday morning with the competence of a man who had learned to cook as a way of taking care of himself. And Douglas complained about the coffee being too strong, and Carolyn mediated the dispute with the efficiency of a woman who had been doing so since 1964, and Eleanor sat in the chair Arthur had built for her and watched her children in the kitchen of the cabin she had come to because she had chosen it, and felt the morning around her as something that belonged entirely to her. She would not have called it happiness. Happiness was too light a word for it. What she felt had more weight than that, more history, more cost. It was the feeling of a life that had arrived somewhere real, somewhere that had been earned rather than given, somewhere that contained not just comfort, but the full truth of a person who had decided at 93 years old that she was worth the fight. The mountains were there at the window. The coffee was strong. The chair was exactly right. She opened her journal on her knee and wrote the date at the top of the page. Below it, after a moment, "Arthur asked me every evening for 40 years what I needed that he hadn't thought to ask." Today I know the answer. This, exactly this. She put the pen down and looked at the mountains and did not need to write anything more. The light moved across the room, the way light moved in this place, specific and unhurried, making its slow progress across the floor the way all things moved in the Blue Ridge, on the schedule of something that had been here long before any of them, and would be here long after, patient and indifferent to urgency, requiring nothing but presence. Eleanor May Whitfield sat in the chair her husband had built for her and was present. That was enough. She understood now what it had always come down to: not safety against all risk, not comfort guaranteed by someone else's decisions, not the managed diminishment of a life reduced to its safest possible version. Just this: the right to be present in your own life, in a place you had chosen on terms that were yours. She had been 93 years old when she had understood this fully enough to act on it. She did not think that was too late. She thought that was exactly on time.